Olha 다 처음에 쓰기도해.
Can you all hear me? I've been very busy today. It's been very hectic. Now, the third branch of the Vedas is called poetics. And what we mean by poetics is that there are the Vedas, the literature, the Aryanakas, and the Upanishads. These two aspects speak a lot about the topics of poetics. And later became an independent area of knowledge that was called like the tradition, the separate tradition of poetics. Now, the fourth branch of Vedas is etymology, nirukta. And so is etymology. Now, the topic of etymology is explanations of the difficult words in the Vedas. To explain them, they developed the etymology to explain these words. In particular, around 400 BCE, there was a celebrated Indian grammarian. So he was this great grammarian in India, and his name was Yaska. I think that's how it's pronounced. So he was a great grammarian, and because of his appearance, all the earlier India just couldn't compare to him. And so they lost all of their influence. And all of these texts were just entirely lost. Now, there's a text written by this scholar, this grammarian named Nirukta. He gave new explanations of the words found in the ancient texts. And so this is where this word, the etymology, or you could also talk about it as being the linguistic study of the origins of language. Now, the fifth branch of grammar is what's called Vyakarana. And in Tibetan, we call this grammar. In Tibetan, in English, it's called grammar. This is basically the basic Sanskrit texts on grammar. And it's primarily an explanation of the grammar of the Vedas. Now, at that time, there are many different texts on grammar. But later, there was a great scholar named Panini. And because of him, all of the texts written by the previous scholars ceased to be used. And so because they were no longer used, the texts themselves were lost. So this is the one who wrote the text called the Panini's Grammar. And this scholar named Panini was born in the northwest. The place where he lived was in the northwest of India. Now, the time when he lived is described differently by different scholars, but in to roughly describe it, it was sometime in between the 4th and the 3rd centuries BCE that he lived. So in modern times, there is a Indologist from Germany. So this name is Max Müller. It's a very long name. German names are difficult to pronounce, but his name is Friedrich Max Müller. And what he says is that people from all over the world who study grammar and linguistics, that there are only two ancient texts of grammar, only two ancient traditions on grammar come from Greece and from India. But if you compare all of them to the text by Panini, then the Greek grammatical texts are basically they're worthless. They don't show any great knowledge. So that the Panini grammar written by Gunan in terms of grammar and linguistics spans a very high time. It's at an even higher level than the ancient Greek grammatical texts, the scholars say. So this formed a tradition of grammar or of linguistics that had never previously been present in the world. Also, in the last couple hundred years, the linguists or grammarians have done a lot of research and put a lot of focus on a certain area of knowledge, and that is the idea that all the different languages of the world came from a single source. So they have this hypothesis that there is a single common origin of all the languages in the world. There are many different languages in the world, but they all come from the same mother. This is their hypothesis or their idea. Now, this hypothesis, if we accept it, then we have to. This actually appeared 2,000 years ago in India. It is said that even at the time by Panini, or that there was a single source of all the Indian languages. So, and this shows that there was a very high level of linguistic and grammatical knowledge at that time. The idea that there's a single mother of all the world languages was taught at that time. In brief, at that time, there was a huge and rapid advance in Indian grammar and linguistics, and this is just amazing. This is what the various scholars say. Now, the sixth branch of the Vedas is astrology. Now, astrology is necessary for this reason. When you're doing the sacrificial offerings, you have to do them at just the right time. And so in order to know what that time is, they developed astrology. And in order to know when to do a ritual, you also know what the good dates, the auspicious dates. In order to know which dates are auspicious or not, to examine which days are auspicious or not, they developed the tradition of astrology. So next, above or earlier, I mentioned the branch of rituals. Among the 6 branches is the first of these branches. The first branch called rituals. And so this branch is made up of 3 different sutras, right? And so one of these sutras is the Dharma Sutras, right? So I thought I'd give an introduction to this Dharma Sutra. Now, when I talk about this Dharma Sutra, it is very important, as I said. Now, it primarily speaks about the ritual, or the form of rituals. What are the order and what are the rules of the rituals? It also shows how to pay respects daily. And it also is like the determination of the standards for the way Dharma practitioners lead their lives. And so it establishes standards for that. It also describes the different powers and responsibilities of the different peoples in society. And it also says how to handle conflicts between these, or that people violate these, how to handle criminals. And so if you look at these, they're similar like the rule books we have in Tibetan monasteries. They're like rule books if we use contemporary terms. So basically, the Dharma Sutras is that people really consider the Vedas to be extremely important. And so taking that as the basis, all of the customs and traditions of the Aryan people, of the Aryan peoples, were systemized into traditions and customs. Likewise, as I mentioned yesterday, there's also the distinctions in castes, the caste system. And so in the Dharma Sutras, it is codified as a law, and so as rules and laws. So now when we speak about caste, if we have to put the tradition of caste into the law texts, first, before we can put it in text, we have to clearly know the classifications of the caste. If you have to know the distinctions, otherwise you wouldn't be able to put them in the law texts. And so in order to put the classification castes into the law books, they first had to really classify and settle the classifications of their castes. And since they needed to classify and clarify the classification of the castes, this gave great difficulties to the people who are writing the texts on the laws. And the reason is that in actual fact, if you need to really clarify the distinction between class, it's actually extremely difficult. And so at the beginning, they're in a position where they just didn't know what to do. And the reason why this is that there were many castes that are not included within those of the four castes. And so where do you put them? They did not know. Now, if they wanted to make more castes, because like the basic foundation of the making the text is that there were no more than four castes and no fewer than four. And so this is the preliminary basis as the foundation of it. So you couldn't make more, you couldn't make less. But if you look at the actual situation, there were many castes who were not included in these four castes. So they didn't know what to do. They gave them a great difficulty. And so they gave them such difficulties that what they did is they started to make explanations to different people. There's so many castes in the actual fact. There are many different castes, but in order they just did it by forced them into the four castes. And so in order to explain this people, then people just sort of thought up anything they could. They kind of brainstormed and came up, looked for some reason. And then they did whatever they could. They didn't have any proper reason, but they just made up whatever they could. And the reason why they made up whatever they thought of, and how we know this, is the time that they're combining all of these different law books, is that there are three main, most influential scholars who are teaching law. And the law texts written by these three texts we can now look at them. And if we look at these three texts, there's no agreement between them. The way they distinguish the castes just don't match. They're the three most influential, but they don't agree with each other. For an example, we have the Gautama, we have the Dharma Sutra by Gautama. So there's a sutra by Gautama. And so here, if the father is Kshatriya and the mother is Brahmin, so what do you consider the child? So the father is Kshatriya and the mother is Brahmana, what is that going to do? If the father is a Brahmana and the child is a Shudra, then what do they go? What are they going? And when you're counting out all these differences, then in the Gautama's sutras, this is what is explained in Gautama's sutra. But the other masters' explanations, there's no agreement among the explanations in the Gautama Dharma Sutra and the classifications given by the other scholars. And the reason why they cannot agree, because the explanations that they just explain them arbitrarily according to their own wishes, and they don't have any sources for any reasons or sources. And there's no factual basis for it, so they just wrote up they had no choice but to write up what they thought, and they wrote their own explanations. So at that time, making this determination of the four castes and clarifying the castes, during the time that this is being conciled, the reason why this occurred is that at that time, there was a kingdom called Videha, and there was also the kingdom of Magadha. And these were the two most powerful kingdoms at that time. However, but the people of these areas were not 100% Aryan peoples. They had kind of mixed with the indigenous peoples of those areas, and so they're not 100% Aryan people. And even what some people say is that some people say that there were people who doubted that they actually were Aryan. What's even stranger than that is that here, as it's explained here, at that time, when describing the divisions into the four castes, they also included the ancient Greek people within the caste system. They knew that there were Greeks at that time. They knew a little bit about them, and when they learned about this, they thought those are the Greek people, so where do they fit? All humans have to be included in the four castes, so there's this Greek peoples. And so which category do we put them in? And this is a discussion that arose at the time. And so they put the Greeks in one of these four times, in the four castes. Now, at that time, there was no connection between Greece and Indian society, but they did know of the existence of Greece, and so they felt like they had to put it in the text, and they just forced it into one of the four categories. As a brief at that time, they talk about the four castes of Brahmas and Kshatriya. If they talk about it, you need to find someone who's a pure Brahmin, who's a pure Kshatriya, or pure Vaishya, or pure Shudra, because all of the castes had kind of mixed before, and so it's difficult to say that there's actually a pure caste. So from the beginning to the end, the entire caste system is just explained from beginning to end based upon their own whatever they made up. There's actually no authoritative source for any of it. And since they have no authoritative source, that the Brahmas at times really underwent a lot of difficulty. They worked hard in order to determine the system. They worked extremely hard to determine and finalize the caste system, and so there's no need to mention how hard they must have worked. So what later scholars say, or the modern scholars say, is that this is a time when the levels of education levels of people was not all that high. And because they weren't so high, and so to make it, and so if it's like, so it's like so they made up things. They used contradictory analogies, and so then, but no one seemed to suspect it. If there's no reason for it, but there wasn't even one who think there's no reason for it, so they think this is very strange. And not only did no one doubt it, everyone thought, oh, the four castes are like the nature things that was made from the gods, and believed it. And it's like incredible that people actually managed to believe this. Because if we think about it simply here, if we were to make up a caste system without, so basically the caste system we look at it, we say it's just made up arbitrarily, but people didn't question it at all at that time, and they believed it. It's very strange. It's like an inconceivable situation. Basically, actually, if there are all these if they had no actual authoritative sources for creating this system, there should have been someone at least who would like the later Buddhists who would actually question it. even now in the 20th century, then in India, there are people who believe in the distinctions in the castes and who consider it to be very important. This is a really incredible situation. It's something. It's not understandable. Now, the Dharma Sutras also speak of the governance, taxation, and how to engage in trade, how to engage in farming, the military strategy, and so forth. And likewise, it also talks about criminal punishments and so forth, criminal law. It also talks about civil law. All of this is described in the Dharma Sutras. But what's strange about that is that people of that time really loved to memorize things. They'd memorize anything. And they would memorize everything. And so the text, they would memorize the text on philosophies, memorize the text on laws. But actually, at that time, there were paper and pens, but few actually ever used them. So what the judges would do, they would memorize the Dharma Sutras and then recite them from memory. And when they're deciding a case, there were no law texts because it's just this memory of that you had in your mind. And it's based on their memory. They made the decisions. And if they forgot something, or if they were mistaken, then that was it. Because they had no legal texts to look at. So just whatever remained in his brain, he could believe it and decide based on that, and then making that decision. If the judge didn't have such a good memory, there's the danger that they do very strange cases. But the Indian people at that time really loved to memorize. And I think actually that they're very stable memories. For example, when we were young, all this in older languages, we have all the people of the older generation have very stable memories, right? When they talk about past events, they would talk about it as like they're reading from a diary and say, "Oh, this happened on this day and that day on the." And the people of our day don't have stable memories, and perhaps it's because we use our phones and computers and everything so much that we use them so much that we're not really giving enough training to our minds. In any case, at that time, the people of India really liked memorizing. Now, the second sutra is the Sutra for Householders. And the reason for talking about this is that there's an important point, which is so this is at that time, the people of India, now what it speaks about in the Sutra for Householders, that the people of the India of that time, it speaks about their daily life. Now, as I spoke about yesterday, it said that there are the three castes that were allowed to practice religion. These were the Brahmins, the Kshatriya, and the Vaishya. And so there were stages of behavior that they had to go through in their state of life. It's like a sequence in this life. So these 4 stages. And so they're called stages or phases, and what they were called are the stage of celibacy, the stage of household life, the stage of forest life, and the stage of going forth. So these are the 4 stages, and these are important, I think. And we have the tradition in Buddhism of going forth and becoming monastic, and this existed in India before the Buddha appeared. And so I think that for today, if we speak about the four stages, then I think we can understand why there's we can understand the source for going forth in Buddhism. Now, the first is the stage of celibacy or brahmacharya. This is when you're a student. This is at a time when you're a student. So if you're a Brahmin, you study from the ages of 8 to 16. If you're a Kshatriya, then you study from the age of 11 to 21. Or if you're Vaishya, you study from the ages of 12 to 24. So the children that age. So this is the Brahma, the stage is for the earlier for the Brahma, a little bit later for the Kshatriya, and a little bit later than that for the Vaishya. And when you reach that age, then you had to go and do your studies. And when you were studying, what you had to do is first you had to wear the Brahma's thread. The reason why you had to wear the Brahma's thread is like, the Brahmas wear this thread around them, and it's called the Brahma's thread. The reason why they wore the Brahma thread is that it shows that they are in a caste that has two of twice born. It's to show that they're members of the Brahmins, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and not a Shudra or an outcast. That's why they wore the Brahma's thread. That meant that they were going off to study. And once they've gone off to study, they would go to a teacher or a guru. They would go to a guru to go study. When they'd go to study, they'd go to the guru, and the place where they stayed was in the guru's house. And the time when they'd study was dependent upon your nature. You could choose to study for 12 years, or 24 years, or 36 years, or 48 years, or so forth. You could study for as long as you liked. You could choose how long you wished to study. Now, the main topic of study was memorization of the Vedas. You had to memorize the Vedas. And while you were memorizing the Vedas, they had a very strict rules. For that time, there was a lot of smoke, This is not talking about smoking like we're talking about. This is talking about other smoke. You were not allowed to inhale smoke. You were not allowed to wear jewelry. You had to tie your hair on the top of your head in a bun. And your clothes had to be made out of hemp. You were not allowed to wear high quality clothing, nor were you allowed to follow your desires. And no matter what whatever the guru said, you had to be obedient and be very respectful. And every morning they would go to the surrounding villages and go asking for begging for alms. So there was the tradition of begging for alms at that time as well. And after they'd come back from the alms round, they'd have to give everything they'd received to the guru. And after the guru had his meal, then the students were allowed to eat their meal. The children were not allowed to eat until the guru had finished. Also, the students would go, had to fetch firewood or water, or sweep in the morning and attend the Brahma fire during the sacrifices. And in the evenings, they had to wash the guru's feet or prepare the guru's bed and so forth. And so it's only after the guru went to bed at night, that the students were allowed to go to sleep. And while doing this, then the students had to study. And what they studied, and they didn't study the same way students do today. Now, at that time, a student would stay in the presence of the gurus and become like a member of the guru's family, and then be the servant. So to be the servant for the guru. Yeah, and so they would work hard that way, and because of their efforts, they would receive some understanding of the ancient wisdom passed down from their ancestors, or so they believed. The students would study with either one guru or with many gurus, and when they'd completed their education, what they would do is the students would give a very large offering to their gurus. They'd give large offerings, and then they would return to their home. And so this is what we call the stage of stability, or the stage of studying, the time when they were students. This is the time when they were studying. Now, the second stage is the stage of household life. The stage of household life is the time that after you'd finished the stage of celibacy, then you'd return home. Once you'd returned home, then what you had to do is you had to get married. And once you'd gotten married, you had to become ready to continue the household traditions. Before you get married, you're a student, right? So once you've gotten married, then their lifestyle was very different. They had to live in a very different type of life. So during the stage of household life, this was considered the most important of the four stages of the life. And the reason for this is that most Indian people were householders. Since most people were living in the householders, this is considered a most important period. Now, during this period of living as a household, you had to do a lot of rituals. There are so many religious rituals, some that you had to do every day, some that you had to do every month, some that you had to do every year. There are many different rituals. There are innumerable rituals that they had to practice. And so that was the stage of household life. And now the next is the stage of forest living. The stage of forest life is, what do we say? Sometimes we hear about Indian masters going off on the conduct, particularly in the secret mantra. We hear about masters who would go off onto the conduct, and I think that this probably means this, or it might mean the fourth stage. It means either one of these two, I believe. Now, what this stage of forest life means is that after staying in the house, you would leave that and then go stay in the forests. And once you've lived in the forests, mainly what you would do is there's nothing else to eat. So what you would eat is you eat tree roots and tree bark. And so they had a very meager lifestyle, very poor food. And so you had to subsist on this very meager food. But even during this time, you still did not stop doing rituals. You had to tend the Brahma fire and do prostrations in the morning and evening and so forth. There are many practices you had to do. But the main purpose was to do practice, and in particular, to rest in meditation on the profound meaning. So the first phase is study. The second is living the household. And the third is what? It is this. It is the stage of practice, the time to actually do practice. Now, the fourth stage is called the period of going forth. Some people call it the time of the yogi, the samyasin, the stage of going forth, or the stage of yoga. And what this is you'd give up entirely, give up the house entirely. You'd shave your head and go forth. And you'd go forth, and other than your body, you'd give up all physical things other than your own body. And you'd undergo ascetic practices and give up food. You'd have one robe. You'd only one meal of arms per day. So you'd only have one robe to wear. And you'd only you'd live on alms and only going on begging for alms. And you could not stay in a single place. You had to go into all sorts of other countries. could not stay longer than one night night in a town. You had to stay in no fixed location. And so as you're going from one place to another, there weren't many rituals that you need to do. However, you always had to recite the Vedas and meditate on dhyana. And you try to see the nature of the world, to separate yourself from the samsara of birth and death, or they would call the nature, the actual nature, the Brahman, right? And so you need to become one in taste with the Brahmana. In brief, you basically need to achieve the happiness of liberation. So for these reasons, if this stage of this stage is also called a bhikshu. It can be called a yaga. It might be called a shramana or a spiritual practitioner. There are many different names for this, but I will explain them later. In any case, when you think about in our Buddhist traditions, I think the going forth, bhikshus and spiritual practitioners, these words come up all the time, right? And these are all existed prior to the appearance of the Buddha in India. And so there were stages that developed before, all of this developed before the Buddha. And if we understand this history, then we can begin to get an idea of why there had to be a tradition of going forth in Buddhism, and why there's a tradition of living in alms. In particular, the reason when we think about the reasons for living on alms, the reason the scholars give for at that time is that in that area, the Aryan peoples had come down to the Ganges River Valley. It's a very, very fertile region, and the crops grew very well. So people had a very good life. And so people's life grew better and better. And because of this, they had a lot of excess food. And because they had so much excess food, when people came asking for alms, they had a lot of food to give these people. What this shows is that at that time in India, there was a very good, the living was very good. And because the living was good, they had excess food to give to the alms. If you don't have any food yourself, then forget about giving food to people begging for alms. So the reason for the tradition of alms is because there was everything necessary to make alms. There was a good living. There was excess food. And so they had extra food that they could give. And so that's why the alms tradition developed. Now, this order of the 4 stages was not a unilateral thing where you had to first go through the phases of stability, then household, and then forest, then going forth. There were also people who first started their studies and then immediately went to the phase of going forth. Someone who had great renunciation, who wanted to free themselves from samsara, then they'd go immediately to the stage from the period of study to the stage of going forth. Now, generally, when we think about the going forth, there's people who had come to a certain age, and people who are coming old enough, the age of 60 or 70. And the reason for this is because they'd already given the responsibilities for their household activities to their elder children, and they didn't have a lot to do in their household anymore. And they said they're going to completely devote themselves to achieving liberation. And so most of these people were people in the 60s or 70s. So people took this lifestyle of going forth, mainly when they're in the 16th or 17th. Now, those who had the great wish for liberation went forth immediately after finishing their studies. In any case, what people of that time is that if you were someone who to go through all 4 stages of these stages, then you're someone who had completed all the stages of human life. And so there are many examples in history of people who went through all 4 stages in their lives. And so from ancient times, India has been a different country than others. They had their own education, they have their own advice and own methods and their own practices. And so the people so it's basically only in India where these were all developed fully, not in any other country. So the people of ancient times worked very hard to go through the stage of the practice and to find all these stages of practice. And this is not pointless. It was very meaningful and extremely beneficial. And this determination of the 4 stages of the life also left a very strong imprint on the Indian civilization. It had a very strong influence. So next is this. And so we talk about the development of ancient Indian areas of knowledge. The main cause for the main condition for the ancient Indian areas of knowledge to develop is the development in religions. Now, the reason why this is that if you think, how did astrology come about? The area of knowledge of astrology, as I mentioned before, when you do rituals, you need to know exactly what data should be conducted upon. In order to know that, you need to examine the scars in the sky. So they developed the wish to look at the stars, and so for that reason, they developed astrology. When we're talking about speeding reading or phonology, if you mispronounce things while reciting the Vedas, then for that reason, they developed this reading or phonology. And so poetics and grammar. No, I've got this wrong. When you talk about grammar, grammar was studied in order to understand the meaning of the ancient literature accurately without any mistakes. That's why I studied grammars. Now, how did philosophy develop? Well, the texts on philosophy were in order to realize the sacredness of the God, or you could say just realize the suchness of the nature. And they thought about this a lot. And this is because they thought about this so much that they developed the texts on philosophy. Now, all of these different areas of knowledge are areas of knowledge that developed in India itself. It's not that they went to other countries and studied them. Likewise, there's also medicine in India. There's a practice of India in India. And the way that the practice of Indian medicine came about is that at that time, when they made sacrifices, they would make offerings of animals. And when we make the offering of the animal, then it's very specific. Because in some sacrifices, you need to offer the heart, you need to offer the liver or the heart or the legs. You had to make the different offerings of different body parts to the gods, and in order to do that, you needed to open up the carcass of the animal and look at it. They see that they understood from that is that and they understood how human and animals anatomy. Then they developed the medical knowledge. So it is said that medicine came from the blessings of the gods, and that people understand it. It is said this, however it was. I was mentioning the sutras before. When this genre of sutras appeared, Indian medicine had already reached a certain degree of development. Like there's also Indian mathematics. This is basically it was developed in India and has its own particular Indian features. For example, we have the decimal system now, right? And I think count things in, we have like 10, 100, 1,000. We have 10, then after that you have 100, then after that you have, so after 1 you have 10, then after 10 you have 100, then 1,000 and so forth. This is a decimal system. And this decimal system also originated in India. There are also the Arabic numerals, the numbers that we use from 1 to 9. These numerals spread to Europe from the Arab lands, and so they're called Arabic numerals in Europe. They're called the Arabic numerals. However, but actually, their original origin is India. It is said. It is said. Likewise, we have 0, right? In Sanskrit, they call it shunya, or empty. Because of this word shunya, they'd invented the idea of 0. This is the invention of 0. It was in India. Likewise, there's also geometry. It's basically measuring things by their shapes. And this is also an area of knowledge that was developed independently in India. The reason why they had to know geometry is that you had to make the mandalas for the rituals. And in order to make the mandalas, you had to know their size. What is the width? What is the total? What is the width? What is the height? And as you measure all that, they developed geometry. So basically, all of these areas of knowledge came from the religions, because of the existence of religion. But one thing that's really quite disappointing is that there are not many mathematical texts from ancient India, and so this is actually a rather disappointing thing. Next, I would like to speak about this. I'd like to speak about the ancient Indian writing systems. As I said before, when in the early Vedic era, during the age of the Rig Veda, there was no writing in India. It was only later that they developed a writing system. And so for this reason, it's because they had writing that they developed the Sanskrit language. And because they had Sanskrit, then they were able to pass down the traditions of literature. Now, if we think about the writing systems or the scripts, the earliest Indian script is the Brahmi script. And here I will show you the Brahmi script. It's this. This is the Brahmi script. So now there was a writing system in the Indus Valley civilization, but we can't read this. So that was the earliest. So now these days, the Brahmi is the earliest Indian writing system. This probably appeared in the 6th century BC. Now, in the 3rd century BC, there was the Emperor Ashoka. And there are many edicts described on caves or in rocks by the Emperor Ashoka. Now, there are 2 different scripts that appeared. So now there are 2 ways to read it. Some are written from the right to the left, and some are written from the left to the right. So these 2 different types of writing systems. If you're reading from right to left, was called Karoshti, the Karoshti Yige. These are read from right to left. So this is it. The Karoshti script is this one. Now, the one that's read from the left to right is the Brahmi, so that's similar. Later in the Common Era, around 400 AD, there were the Gupta letters. These are Gupta letters. This is the Gupta script. So these are the Gupta scripts that were used in the Gupta era. This basically took the Brahmi script as its basis and changed it a little bit. Around the 7th century, the Gupta script then all of a sudden disappeared. And the reason it ended is not known. So around the 8th century, the Gupta scripts were once again spread. And at that time, the script that developed that time is what we call the Nagari script. So this is the Nagari script. And so it turned into this Nagari script. As it comes in around the 13th century, the Nagari script was refined and reformed, improved, and what it's called then is called. They added a new prefix to it. They made a new script, and they called it the Devanagari. And in order to praise the qualities of the Sanskrit language, they added, as a prefix to the word Nagari, they add the word Deva, or God. And so it's now called this Devanagari script. And so this is the Devanagari script is now the script used for Sanskrit and Indian languages is now this Devanagari script. So this is an explanation in terms of these scripts. Now, in terms of the languages, if you think about it in terms of there's this change in terms of script, there's that development, but in terms of language, there's nothing particular. The Aryan peoples were in the north, and then they gradually spread throughout India. And they came from the Indus Valley down to the Ganges Valley, and they spread in that area. And as they're spreading in that area, there are the colloquial languages. There are many different colloquial languages. They mixed with these. So they're mixing with all the different colloquial languages. And this is called the Prakrit, or this is called the natural languages. So this is basically means the colloquial language. Later, as they mixed as it mixed with all the different local languages, each language has different pronunciations, right? It's like in Tibetan, we have the Central Tibetan, the Khampa and Amdo dialects. We have all these different colloquial languages, right? Now later, in order to standardize all these languages, the Brahmas took many of the grammatical points in the Vedas and Brahmanas and the Upanishads, and they made a new grammar. And the deciding the grammar was probably the time of this was probably in about the 5th century BC. This is when there was the scholar named Yaska, and then in the 4th century there was Panini, the scholar, in the 4th century BC. So during their time, they settled the grammar of the Sanskrit language, and then it was accepted throughout Indian, and this became the pure and the very commonly accepted Sanskrit language. And so they were able to develop this language. If compared to colloquial languages, this is a more finely formed, or a language that many scholars had created as well as they could. So it's called the well-formed language, or Sanskrit. And so that is what is said. Now, the last thing I'd like to speak about today is this. Oh, it closed itself. What happened? So the last topic I'd like to speak about today is this. As I spoke about the Vedas and the Brahmanas and the Sutras, and if we want to compare them, we don't need to speak about the time, but if we think about they each have their own unique styles. And so when the Vedas originally appeared in the Punjab, and their topic is primarily their worship of the natural environment seen as gods. And it's written primarily in verse. But the Vedas themselves came because of the blessing of the gods. They're like pure appearances from the gods and then recited orally. Now, the Brahmanas, or when the Aryas had come down to the Ganges River Valley, and they wrote them at that time. And the style is written in prose. And the topic is primarily about the rituals, and in order to come to a greater understanding of the meaning of the rituals. And later also it said they also are said to have come from the blessings of the gods, due to which people had the Brahmana texts. And then later, the Aryan people gradually as the Aryan peoples gradually spread further through the Ganges Valley, the Brahmanas became common, and they're very long, and they're very difficult, and they're very long sentences, and so they wanted to make them a bit short and more concise, and so that is how the sutras came about. And so now these are related with the philosophy and the grammar and the areas of knowledge. And so they become like textbooks. So the sutras are basically textbooks, and so that's the form they took. And the style they're written in was in verse. And so those that are in verse and that are very concise are what we call sutras. So in this way, the Vedas and the Brahmanas and the Sutras, if we think about it in easy, or if we think about the difference, this is in a simple way, that's an easy way of explaining it. So I think that seems to be enough for today. This is where we need to leave it today. So tomorrow is a day off, and the day after tomorrow, we'll speak about the 6 softest schools. We need to have some sort of an introduction to them, because when we were studying them, when we were studying the great philosophical texts, we talk about these non-Buddhist schools. And so if you can have an introduction to them, I think it'll be beneficial. And after we've spoken about the 6 non-physical Buddhist schools, then we'll speak about the Buddhist era and the appearance of the Buddha and so forth. Actually, this year, I've extended the time, but the content, there's so much to speak about. And it's difficult to speak about everything that needs to be said in this year, but I'm not going to rush through it. In particular, when it's speaking about the topic of Buddhism and the origins of the Buddha, and the original and the development of the original teachings of Buddha, I'm not going to rush through it. I'm not going to go into so much detail, but I want to be able to give a good introduction to all of you. Even if we're not able to speak so much about the topic of mantra, and we won't rush through it and just continue. I'd like to just continue going, taking our time to go through it. So now we will recite the dedication prayers.